in the flow of the conversation, we'll certainly do that. I'm sure it'll add to it. We're going to try and cover how data and technology is being used throughout the life of the project. So during pre-construction, construction, and operation. That's a big agenda, and hopefully we'll get all the way to the end, but we also don't want to stifle an interesting conversation as well. And part of the most interesting part that we've found is not just talking about what's being done and what we're doing. Some of it is really highlighting what needs to be done and what still is an issue that needs to be solved. And we don't claim to have all the answers to that, but I think we have been able to pose some very interesting questions in that regard. So I'll kick it off here. I'm going to kind of go back and forth between slides and in the speaker view here. I think maybe Jody, a logical place to start, since we're starting in the pre-construction section. Pre-qualifications of trades is one area that EllisDon's working on, as well as collaborating with the rest of the industry. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing there?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, hi everybody. Great to be virtual with everyone today. And as David said, we are at EllisDon are looking at how we can use data across everything that we do. We're obviously moving towards being more of a technology company than anything else. That's our ambition now. And so, as David said, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time looking at over the last several years is how we can use the data that we have, how we can share the data that we have across our industry in order to make all of our projects better. One of the areas of focus for us has been collaborating with a partner to develop a subcontractor rating platform. We call that Compass. It is basically for all general contractors. We intake a lot of data from our subtrades and subcontract partners. That can be financial data, it can be safety data. And what we were finding was we were doing it for every project. And that's frankly no fun for anybody. That's no fun for our trade partners who have to submit it all the time. And obviously there's sensitive information, particularly around the financials. So, so we've worked together to develop a platform. We call it Compass. And that is a product that's now being used across the industry in Canada. And it has membership from several different general contractors. Subcontractors subscribe to this service where they can input their data and they can specify what is to be shared. I know some of our surety partners are on the call today, and certainly that information is useful to those partners, as well as we look at securing project security for our various bids. And we've found that data has really assisted us in identifying major areas of risks, particularly around subcontractor default. So it's really changed the way that we plan our projects, the partners that we select, and the ways in which we identify risk.
So Jody, we kind of talked about this in relation to another need in the industry, or a similar need, where I believe the subcontractors, they're responsible for submitting their information to that platform. And another kind of related thing, and this was an interesting article that I saw in the Financial Post recently, talking about how Canada's steel industry has one of the lowest carbon footprints in the world, and that might soon be as important or more important than the price. So that leads to a whole bunch of questions about data and how do you implement that, and how can you objectively evaluate it and award on the basis of it. And I guess the difficulty there is, where are you getting the data? How do you know what the embodied carbon is of different materials? And it's not just different materials. You know, if you were to follow what this is saying, you need to know the embodied carbon of different mills for different steel. So unless right now, as far as I know anyway, there is no database where you can objectively go and say this mill has a carbon foot of X and that mill has a carbon foot of Y, so that you can measure and evaluate those things. So if we were going to do that, first of all, we need the data to do it. And I think it's unrealistic to expect a third party is going to kind of go and gather that data. You would have to have some sort of system where suppliers that want to work on particular projects, they're going to have to pre-qualify. They're going to have to submit that information for the bidders to use. It also opens up a whole can of worms about contracting and tender award and evaluation of that. Jack, in your role, you're certainly involved in thinking about and strategizing about environmental impacts of your projects. So what are your thoughts on kind of measuring and using embodied carbon as a contract award criteria?
Yeah, so as everybody's probably on this call well aware, at the city we have the Toronto Green Standard that has set the pathway to net zero emissions new construction by the end of this decade, 2030. It'll actually be ratcheting up next year to the 4th version of the Toronto Green Standard, the newest version. What we've started to introduce at that level is actually the calculation of embodied carbon for higher tiers of performance standards in Toronto. Ourselves as a city, we're in the early days of actually starting our own green procurement methodology, where we're setting metrics around how we can, in the city, with a leadership role, how we can evaluate the different criteria when we go to market for design and procurement, which is great. We think that scope 3, though hasn't been a focus of TGS so far, it is something that we need to be very conscious of as we move forward. It's always difficult. You raised some good questions there, David, around the accountability of it. Really where we are now is embedding the low carbon principles in our estimating and design process. And in hopes from there, we can work collectively with the industry, whether it's architects, engineering firms, construction managers, developers themselves, and then work collectively as an industry to start putting some really standardization and benchmarking around some of these metrics. It's a very emerging entity, but there's a lot of work being done around it in the Toronto space. So it's an exciting time, but there are some challenges ahead around what you said around verification, how we collect the data, things like that.
I think too, like there's a certain amount you can do in your design, but then on top of that, the contractor still selects what subcontractors and suppliers are going to have, and there's different, even if the design is finished, who they select and who they award to is going to change your embodied carbon. So, I'm not suggesting you have the answers, Jack. In fact, I think it's fair to say nobody has the answers at this point. This is more just posing the challenges of doing that. And if you're talking about a situation such as a P3 with these groups, when you go and bid, you don't even have your whole design done. You may not know how much of the building is concrete versus steel versus some other structure, let alone which mill it's coming from. And you can't know which mill it's coming from until you know the sizes of your steel members. So it gets really difficult to measure it at all. Impossible at the moment, really. There is no objective source of truth for what that embodied carbon is, and there would need to be. But even if that data was there, in a design, build, or a P3 project, you won't know what your embodied carbon is until you've finished designing and procuring the building. So that raises a whole bunch of interesting things about tendering and award, and how do you hold someone accountable? What do they do if they don't meet their embodied carbon requirements? I'm sure there's a lot of kind of legal and contractual things you could do, including liquidated damages or buying carbon credits. As a recovering estimator from a general contractor myself, it raises some real nightmares about, just getting your price together is difficult, and how do you get your embodied carbon bid together and figure out how do I trade off carbon with cost if they're both going to be analyzed. So I think it's a worthwhile goal, but one that I think we're pretty far away from being able to implement and objectively measure. Jody, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're touching on something that's really important to us right now, and we're spending a lot of time talking about how we align, both for our projects and more broadly for the industry, the values that we have around sustainability and carbon reduction right now with the policies that exist in our industry and the methods of procurement. And right now we seem to have a disconnect. And I know Jack and his team at the City of Toronto, they're working very hard on this around the TGS standards and updating those TGS standards. But you've hit on an important topic, David, which is how do you ensure when you are trying to implement those values and policies into a procurement process that there's also a level of fairness that can be achieved through the procurement process and objective standards that we as general contractors and subcontractors can be measured against. And I think right now we're still in a bit of a learning phase. We're trying to learn from some of our colleagues and partners in Europe, for example, where they're a little bit ahead of us still, and working with tech companies that are coming up with environmental product declarations for Canadian products and North American products that we regularly buy and use in our projects. So it is still emerging, but it is really about creating that objective way of measuring some of these more subjective requirements for our project, and moving away, as we've had predominantly on P3 projects, since we're all C2P3 here, moving away from evaluation based on price alone. And that's where we really think that we need to go.
Yeah, agreed. I think this could be a whole conversation here, but I think it has to start with the data. If we don't have some objective data that we are all using the same objective data to start measuring from, you really have no place to start tackling all the other issues. And tying it back to Compass, something similar to that, where you, as a part of your pre-qualification or as some separate federal government database, you have to submit and not so much pre-qualify. You could be very carbon intensive and be part of that database. It's just if your bids are being evaluated on the basis of carbon as well, you probably have a much lower chance of successfully procuring work. But knowing what your embodied carbon is and having it verified in some objective way so that all of the bidders have access to that same data set, I think is needed, but not there yet. Okay, so that was the pre-construction. Jack or Jody, anything else to add to pre-construction before we move on to some construction discussions?
Lots to talk about, but we can carry on.
Okay, so moving into construction, I think one of the things that came up yesterday as kind of a segue into this is we're collecting a lot of data. Like within Altus, we have a ton of data. I'm sure within both the City of Toronto and EllisDon, there's a ton of data. On our parts, we're collecting, like we open 1,000 new projects every year, and a lot of those projects we've got estimates on them. An awful lot of them we do construction loan monitoring on them. So we've got data on construction costs, cash flow, soft costs, revenues, every kind of thing that hits the developer's books that the bank has to fund. And that's great data, but I guess there's two things. Number one, what are you allowed to do with it? And number two, how do you make any sense out of it and make it useful? So I've kind of done that backwards, but let's start with number two. And I'll kind of kick this one off here. So just give you an example. None of this is confidential data. In fact, what I'm showing you, this is from Statistics Canada. So just an example of making sense out of just massive data sets. The data on its own is not really valuable. It's asking great questions and being able to answer those questions. And Altus has invested quite heavily in a business intelligence tool called Tableau. We've got a lot of infrastructure around it. And this is an example of with Stats Canada, we're through an API, we've automated the extraction, transform, and loading of that data into our databases and visualized through Tableau. And you know, for this data set, if you were to go to Stats Canada, first of all, it would take you a while to find what you're looking for and what you need. But second of all, it is a massive data set. It would take you a long time and quite a bit of computing power to download it. And even then, you've got a massive bunch of spreadsheets. Like, what does it mean? So one use case for this would be, you know, if you've got a delay claim for weather days, and this is what this is set up to do, you know, and really a matter of minutes, you know, we can put in here, okay, well, what is considered a weather day? This is just a static image, but we have a live Tableau, so we can put in, okay, 35 degrees is above 35 degrees is a weather day, below 25 is a weather day. Rain, snow, and wind speed, you can do the same thing, set your time frame, and it'll automatically give you how many weather days were there during that period. Or you can go back, say, over the past 5 years and say, what's the average, and you know, how much do we have now, and is there a difference between the two? So I think, you know, being able to make sense of the data, collecting it is a challenge, but being able to make sense and having some actionable, useful intelligence you get out of it is the next challenge that you have. So Jody or Jack, do you have any thoughts or things to add on that?
Yeah, certainly, you're absolutely right, David. I mean, we're sitting on mountains of data now, and we're just creating more and more every day. And so the real trick of all of this now is to harvest that data in a way that is useful for our own processes, useful for our clients. I mean, certainly the place that we are moving to is really around giving real-time data to our clients so they can see live how we're doing from a progress perspective, where we stand on any particular scope of work, and as you well know, where we stand in relation to our drawdown curves, our costs, so that they can have an idea of where the project health stands overall. And so I think that is where we're moving to. We're using all kinds of unique ways now to collect that data, whether it is you know, from drones and LiDAR scanning during the course of construction. We're using our own proprietary project management software to collect in a consistent way the data across all of our projects so we can create a feedback loop internally. And then I think there are all of the emerging ways that we're using technology and data, including around embedding sensors within concrete slabs so that we can test for cure times and strength without having to take samples off-site, and obviously that has an impact on schedule and those types of things. So, you know, everyone is creating their data lakes now and applying whatever softwares and APIs that they have in order to extract that data into a usable format. So, you know, we're creating project dashboards for clients. We're creating dashboards for ourselves as well, so we can know exactly where we are, and hopefully throughout that process create greater certainty in everything that we do, and hopefully we'll move some of those detractors around productivity in construction away from their own positions as well.
I think actually you raised a interesting third leg. There isn't just 2 points, there's the collaboration. There's a huge lost opportunity. We're all collecting data. Sometimes we're collecting the exact same data. One example we came up with is, even if we're not working directly together, a lot of times EllisDon or other contractors indirectly were involved behind the scenes doing construction loan monitoring. And the contractor may not even know we're there, but they'll feel it when the money doesn't get released from the bank on time. So having access to that data that the contractor is generating so that we can verify work completed in a more efficient way really is something that can help us all. And I think there's both the kind of cultural part to overcome of being willing to share the data, but then there's also the tools to efficiently share it. That it seems there's new tools coming up all the time, but until one of them emerges as kind of the leader that most people are using, it's very difficult to share and collaborate. And Jack, I'm assuming that sharing and collaboration of data for the City of Toronto is probably an equal opportunity that's being missed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, data really, the way that we kind of look at it, or I look at it, is data is an opportunity for us to close the loop on the development cycle, from procurement through construction and operations. The TGS was designed in such a way to have really hard metrics around data, so that, and even when it comes to our modeling inputs, the weather modeling inputs and things like that, it's to ensure that we're creating industry feasible or sensitive policies. The point about just the calculations of embodied carbon, I know we have issues around that, but we don't assign necessarily hard targets to it at this point. We really just want to prepare the industry to start thinking about it, and then we can come together and collectively try to understand how we make sense of the data. What is the right form for collection? Is there, what different levels of government play a role in the regulatory aspect of the collection and management of that information? So for us, the data is really a feedback mechanism to make sure that we're able to stick to design metrics, that we can update our modeling evaluations appropriately for changing weather conditions, changing market conditions. So for me, it really closes that development life cycle from designing good buildings to operating good buildings. There's no shortage of data. We deal with it, or we get it from a lot of different sources, essentially, right? Because a lot of developers and entities
in a mess and no consistency whatsoever. I'm assuming.
Yeah, and it's very challenging internally sometimes to really validate some of the information, or there's a lot of negotiation between engineering companies around, is this the right metric? Is that the right metric? So having consolidation and standardization, I think, would be very beneficial for the development sector, at least in kind of the planning design phase.
So the other thing you raised there, and that's kind of what I raised as well at the beginning of this part of the conversation, was just what can you do with it? And I know from our perspective, even when we're developing a product that is very derivative, is 5 steps removed from the original data, and you couldn't possibly discern any of the original data from what we have as an output. Like, we're using it internally as a reference, but any suggestion that it's going to be provided externally to anyone, all of a sudden you end up in red tape and legal paralysis. And I think that's not to knock any of the lawyers. That's their job and that's what they're there for, but it really highlights this need, either regulatory from a government perspective, but even, I would argue from an industry perspective to have some sort of consensus on, when is it sufficiently anonymized and derivative that, you can go ahead and use it. And I was actually just thinking of this just a little while ago. A very good example of this I find is I'm going to say schizophrenia of people on one hand asking for these benchmarks and some industry information that they can benchmark to, which obviously must be based off of the wider data you have, but then in the next breath saying, but you shall not touch or use or do anything with my data beyond just this project. Look at it and throw it out and forget you have it. And that extends to, frankly, many governments. Like the most extreme example I can think of is a lot of government tenders will ask you, okay, list a bunch of relevant projects, their name, who the client was, what their original budget was, what the final contract value was. And then literally later in the same document, if you're successful, you'll sign this contract, which says, you shall not collect, use, or disclose any of our information, including the price. You're going, you just asked me for that to bid for your project, and your contract says you shouldn't provide it. If you were to follow their contract to the letter of the law, you couldn't respond to that RFP in the first place. So I think as an industry, we really, it's kind of everything in the kitchen sink in the contract. Just cover your ass, nobody's allowed to use anything without any consideration whatsoever for, I'm going to say greater good of the industry, including the person calling that tender to be able to use it in reasonable ways. And I don't know what to say about it other than I'm incredibly frustrated by all the great things we could be doing that just seem to get stalled by paralysis to try and overcome this question. So now that I've let go on public entities there, Jack, I didn't mean to create a fight, but go ahead and hit back if you disagree.
I mean, this is in the construction industry, this is a really transformational time. I think collaboration with the industry, that's kind of our focus at the city, is working with development partners to ensure that the policies we put in place are appropriate. My lawyers might not agree with some of that, but the city is working hard to be very transparent. Like the city, we're required to lead by example. So we actually have to do the cost analysis of going to net zero today from a city's perspective. So we're not only the regulators, we are developers at the same time, but we can't do that without the private sector partnerships to ensure that we're meeting our own mandates, right?
And to be clear, my example of governments wasn't meant to suggest it's only governments. They're just the most obvious ones because they do it in a very public way. They issue formal RFPs. The developers usually is a phone call. You know very well that they would be upset if you said anything about their job, but it doesn't stop them from saying, can you give me specific information that is obviously confidential, right? We all want the information, but none of us want it to be our information that's shared. Jody, I'm sure you run into this as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we certainly believe around here that leadership requires transparency. And so, we've tried to be really open across the industry around what we're doing. We've created some industry collaborative initiatives, particularly around climate action. But I think obviously there's a time and a place for confidentiality as well, and to the extent that there is something proprietary or that might give somebody an advantage or that is sensitive. I mean, we obviously work on projects, and I can think of one that we're working on right now that has particularly sensitive information associated with it, and designs have to be protected. All of that is really important, which of course brings us into the whole big enchilada of cybersecurity and how we manage our data from that perspective. So there's the two pieces. There's the physical protection of that data, and then there's the legal protection of that data, which can be equally important. But I have to agree with, I think, what both of you were saying, which is in between those two things, where it isn't secret sauce and it isn't about extracting, in a nefarious way the data that might exist floating around in the Ethernet, that we have to collaborate in the middle, and we have to share data across the industry in order to make all of us better. I mean, I alluded to some of the criticisms that we get in the industry around our lack of productivity, and I think that, again, that's partly tied to the way that our work is procured, that has required us to be quite sensitive to pricing and data and methodologies even getting out into the marketplace, because it is so much of our special recipe or secret sauce. So I think we have to try to break down some of those barriers. Remember what is really important on that proprietary side, protect our data on the cyber side, and then open it up in the middle.
I think just to add to that, and I'm not claiming there's not things that are confidential and should be confidential. In fact, a huge portion of what we're all collecting is and should be confidential. But I think this carpet bombing approach that everything everywhere is confidential, it's kind of I don't think it's the intent. If you describe that to the people in these organizations, the managers, I don't think it was their intent that that's what would happen. But when it's easiest just to follow the cookie cutter contract that's always been done, and just cover your ass, for lack of better words, of just make sure everything is excluded. And if we're going to continue to do that, we're going to continue to miss an opportunity to really capture the value that could be had. And I think that's what, as an industry, we all got to realize that we're all part of that, and not just to use the cookie cutter contract that's always been used. I think that's as an industry, I think we have to learn that. I think there's a certain amount that governments could do as well to clarify these things. The other thing I would say too, as an industry, is we all tend to think that far more of what we're doing is special and secret sauce than it really is. The number of kind of humdrum spreadsheets that I've seen that people claim, don't disclose this is top secret and will destroy me, and you look at a pretty underwhelming spreadsheet with a few formula errors and ask yourself, how did this person think that this was anything different than the wider industry? That's kind of a extreme example of, I think we assume that too much of our stuff is real special and top secret, and it really isn't. And until we realize that, we're not going to share what we have.
I think that's quite right. Although I would say, just to play devil's advocate with you for a minute, I think that is likely subject to change as we go forward. I mean, we are seeing so much more of what we do being dependent on technology. I mean, EllisDon's had its own research and development team for about 20 years now, and that team has never been busier. They're looking at, everything from, design around mass timber to, low carbon concrete, whatever it might be right now. And I think that we are, as we move towards becoming that technology company that I talked about earlier, I think we are also moving into an area where we will have to be sensitive to our own research and development and, some of that more proprietary information that we create.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, we should move on to operations then, past the construction part. So Jody, EllisDon's a major player in P3 as well as building operation. So are you guys have any interesting things under development or that you're involved in that you want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think we're trying to carry the data that we have all the way through design and construction right into that operations phase. So, you know, that can be, you know, very relevant to how we operate the building. We want to get to the place where we are working with that full digital twin that we've created through the construction process in order to make our operations more efficient. We're looking at and working with softwares that will perform automated fault detection and diagnostics within the built environment so that our operators can use a more predictive process when it comes to maintenance and operations. I mean, I think if we take that from a hospital project, again, in-house, you see EllisDon doing things that a construction company wouldn't typically be doing. We've developed our own proprietary alarm and event management platform that's taking information from disparate hospital systems, bringing it together in a usable format for the clinicians. So everything from real-time location and nurse call and security systems, that's all getting aggregated for the healthcare practitioners. So we're stepping out of.
You're into some pretty heavy data questions there. Beyond just financial and design of the building, you're talking about personal information from patients in a hospital, which is probably about as sensitive as it gets. So how do you deal with that? How are you kind of weighing that privacy and regulatory, frankly, you're wading into there with being able to leverage it?
Absolutely, and you know, I think that for us, it's taking the next step in the third P of the PPP, right, around partnership, and that's, you know, incumbent upon us to provide solutions for our clients. You know, we see quite often now in P3 projects, for example, that you know, when the specification is created for the project, it may be aspirational sometimes in terms of the technology that it's looking for. It may be created several years before the project is ever built. And then, of course, everything changes through the construction process. So it's really important for us to provide solutions that match our clients' needs, whether that's you know, purely construction related or whether that's operationally focused. And so that's where you see us moving into those things. But again, from a pure maintenance perspective, you know, we see the data that it's now available, even from the building automation system, or from those digital twins, or what we call a centralized management platform. That's providing us with the ability to detect issues before they're issues. It's providing us with the ability to create more efficient, energy efficient spaces, which is of course important on P3s where we have pain share and gain share obligations. And it's, you know, allowing us to remotely monitor the performance of our teams as well. So, you know, we can see how our teams are responding to particular work orders as they're issued.
Jack, I believe City of Toronto might own a building or two as well. Are you doing anything interesting in this space, or, you know, if not, are there any kind of frustrations or desires to do better in the operation of buildings and collection, leveraging the data you're generating?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Toronto is uniquely placed from a city perspective because we own rather unique buildings in the form of community centers, pools, libraries. So they're not your traditional kind of office residential buildings mostly. What we've identified this issue, and we're integrating, as I mentioned earlier, a climate lens into our capital budget and state of good repair budgeting process across all divisions. So applying a climate lens to when it comes time to replace certain equipment and perform certain things, go through the energy audit, ensure that we have considered decision or have made decisions based on environment and climate change. That's another actual part of our entire city in corporate real estate management. kind of my mandate is working more closely with the private sector, and we see a big kind of gap here, honestly. And I don't want to get political in any of this, but once a building has kind of been commissioned and released into the marketplace, it's kind of a little bit, from our perspective, it's a bit of a wild horse. We don't have any really jurisdictional authority to collect information or mandate the disclosure, carbon disclosure of how a building actually operates. So the development life cycle kind of cuts off once we go into operations, and we're trying to kind of feed back into or create a feedback mechanism back into the design phase. One business opportunity that we're promoting more widely across the city is this idea of energy as a service. There's a lot of specialized entities out there that understand energy a bit more concretely than maybe, for example, a condo board might understand. So we're really trying to promote these private sector business models that allow for companies, asset owners to really take control of their building and start to do more preventative maintenance. And it's just created a different marketplace of energy as a service. So trying hard to support the private sector from asset owners as well as experts in this area to kind of close that loop and make sure buildings operate the way they're designed.
Jack, and sorry to put you on the spot. We haven't brought this discussion up, but I don't know if you'd be involved in it or not, but I've seen demonstrations of companies that are retrofitting buildings with fairly inexpensive IoT devices, so sensors throughout the building and stuff. So some of your older buildings can have more modern, smart technology capabilities in it. Is the City of Toronto, or are you aware of any initiatives to try and retrofit older buildings to improve their operational capacity or operational and maintenance efficiency through that type of thing?
Yeah, are you just referring to city-owned assets, or?
Yeah, city-owned assets, but I guess kind of where I was going from that perspective as well is just from a private perspective, a lot of these large pension funds and developers, now want to promote themselves as green and their buildings as green and their operations as green. And, I think it's a little bit of a wild west in actually verifying what's being said at the moment. So I think in some way to verify those type of things, the industry has got to go towards that. Your older buildings, you have to, I would think, have it monitored and censored so that you can verify your claims. Have you seen any of that, either publicly or privately?
Privately, yes. Publicly, we're kind of taking a larger approach to the city's portfolio and applying BAS systems to them and ensuring that they are, again, a bit of a different context in our portfolio given the kind of archetype, size, and nature of a lot of buildings. Whether it's a community center or a toilet for parks and forest and recreation. So it's a unique profile. So we're trying to address the whole profile with not uniform solutions, but a well thought out kind of BAS systems. I don't want to really step on my tongue because I work outside of the city, like the facilities management office, and more on the new construction side of things. So there is this initiative of deep retrofits. Again, it's a bit of an art. With new construction, it's a bit of a clean slate. With old infrastructure, you need to balance the business case around your quick payoffs, your quick wins with LED lightings, and maybe some of the more difficult ones around envelope and insulation. So it's working quite closely with the capital markets and state of good repair programs to ensure you identify a deck of solutions in a retrofit so that certain payoffs can offset other ones. In some cases, there is no payoff for retrofit interventions. So we work closely with other divisions to try to figure out, what is the opportunity here? What is the state of good repair? How can we find co-benefits in a retrofit so that we can integrate things like renewable energy, storage, reduce consumption, conservation, and make it and then monitoring and metering is a big part of that as well. So it's more of a deck of solutions than it is kind of just we're going to put sensors in and we'll be good to go.
Okay.
We work closely with the industry to make sure that we understand the data. We use reference buildings as a way to model out that exercise and ensure the interventions are holistic and relatively deep.
So we're coming down to the last 10 minutes, and certainly we could probably talk for another hour, and we'll at least fill up the 10 minutes. But I wanted to open it up. Was there anybody from the viewers here that wanted to chime in or ask any questions? I'll take that as a no. Please jump in and interrupt me if you had a burning question. Jack and Jody, just one last thing. The other thing we were talking about, like all of this technology to collect data and better manage your building. Part of the push-pull there is, everybody wants the latest and greatest and be efficient, but then when it comes to actually designing and procuring it, nobody wants to be the guinea pig to use new technology. So it's very difficult to both have the latest and greatest, but only have tried and true and tested. And I think, Jack, you had experienced examples of that frustration in your position as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a risk, right? I mean, the phrase I hear a lot is, nobody ever wants to be first in this respect, but nobody wants to be last. Everybody's happy kind of being second. We do have some programs in the city, like the Green Map, the Green Municipality Acceleration Program, where we leverage city assets to test out different technologies. So we did that with a company called HydroStore and a few others. So we are working closely with the industry to create validation around the integration of new technologies. We do actually district energy development ourselves. So we face similar issues around, what is the next newest and greatest, or not newest and greatest, but what is the next technology that's going to win the race? We're seeing ground source heat pumps gain a lot of traction in the city of Toronto more widely. We have that capability in the larger Canadian market of drilling. So we're starting to see that's an idea, or it's a business that we're starting to see emerge because we've done a few of them now, and the expertise lives now within the city to get that done. But yeah, there's a risk associated with any new technology, and from a city's perspective, accessibility, equality, and all these different issues need to be considered. So it can be a bit slower for us to get comfortable with solutions, but I wouldn't say that's stopping us. We really do need to see some systematic changes in the way we build if we want to meet some of the higher levels of the Toronto Green Standard. For instance, in a tier 3, tier 4, or net zero building, there's not going to really be an opportunity for any type of natural gas or fossil fuel on site. So it'll be the electrification of a building, and then fuel switching for energy generation and storage. But again, a lot of issues around that I could go on for a while about.
And 2 minutes left. Jody, any anecdote to add to that, or?
I mean, I think we had a great conversation about this the other day, and certainly not to throw too much at Jack, but I think there's a great opportunity for the public sector to take the lead and embrace the use of new technologies within their infrastructure, because as we know, on the private sector side, or even where private finance is involved, capital markets on P3s, whatever it might be, there's a real reticence to be that first out of the box, as Jack said. And while we know we have to protect taxpayer dollars on the other side of things, there's certainly a bit more opportunity, I think, on the public sector side to try some of those things out. And I think to the extent that we can move more broadly across the industry to performance-based specifications rather than real hard specs in terms of what is required, then I think you'll see the industry stepping up to use more and newer technologies in everything that they do. And yes, not everything is going to work out perfectly, but I think you know, I think when the onus is on the private sector to come up with solutions and then be responsible for their performance, I think you can get great outcomes.
Great. Andrew, we'll hand it back to you.
Well, I think what I'll do is we've had one question that's actually just come in on the side there. So I figured I'd just throw it to you guys for a quick minute or two to answer that question, and then I'll come back in and wrap things up.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Ray, about sharing and scrubbing data. In my experience, the best way to do that is to have the data coming in as clean as possible in the first place, and setting some criteria around how it has to be entered and the format it's in. Having that baked into the system that you're collecting it is your best chance at that. Once it's in there, as long as it's reasonable, there are things you can do, like using Tableau. We go and do some analysis of it. We go and try and identify the outliers. We've got other things we are doing for scrubbing it. And frankly, in some cases where there's just strange outliers, we exclude it from the data if there's just obvious errors. But your best hope is to set up a system that it's coming in as clean as possible in the first place. The Excel spreadsheets, unless you're really going to lock them down, good luck collecting it from Excel and in a clean and structured way that you can do something with it. That's my thought. Jody or Jack, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's, hi Ray, I think that's a really good point around, you know, the standardization of the data, making sure that it's clean, and then really vetting your service providers as well to make sure that they're trustworthy and that they've got all of the processes and proper credentialing in place to make sure that that data is maintained in its anonymized form.
One thing, sorry, that we're doing and is really quite cool. Microsoft on their Power Platform and developing Power Apps, like we're just getting into this now. But you know, someone who's not a computer programmer can develop simple apps using Microsoft's Power Platform, you know, and control how data is collected and manipulated and input. Like there's some things you can do with just really simple apps without building some real big sophisticated thing. And you know, those types of applications really help structure and collect the data in a usable way.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate that. I mean, the scrubbing, the quality of the data is really what you're looking for. From our perspective on the planning side of it, it's creating kind of simple ways of ensuring that the industry is aligned with the information and the expectations of the information that they're supposed to be providing. So the city does do a lot of consultations with energy developers, or energy modelers, I should say, around the trainings on the software programs that we accept for some of the approval processes. So, you know, to ensure the accuracy and scrubbing of the data, it's really making the intake of that data very clear and very concise, so that people know what to expect when they go through these processes.
That's fantastic. Thanks for getting that last question in there. We'll wrap up really quick now. I'd just like to thank David, Jack, and Jody for agreeing to do this event today, and we really appreciate your insight and your thoughts on this issue, and it was great to have you. Just as a quick aside, as a reminder to everyone watching, we're taking a summer break now for the month of August, so we'll be back in September. And we'll have a really good lineup of speakers for the fall that we'll be able to release to you all then. So look for our emails in our morning news clippings. Likewise, be sure to check out our conference as it's starting to really come together. You can check out our conference on our website. Really excited about some great content coming out of that as well. So with that, thank you, everyone. Have yourself an excellent afternoon, and we'll hear you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.